He, him, when history collides with modern morality. Orleans House in Richmond is the custodian of around 80 of Richard Burton's possessions, donated by Isabel after his death. It contains items such as a gun and swords, clothing and books, photographs and paintings, and it's probably the largest collection in the public domain and well worth seeing. So, a few months ago, along with a couple of other very erudite Burton scholars, a pilgrimage was made to his tomb, and then onto nearby Orleans House, where these objects were on display. Or, as we found on our arrival, had been displayed, for the room is now empty. Everything has been put into storage. All that remains are a dozen books on a shelf and a sheet of paper headed Richard Burton, Orleans House, History and Our Colonial Legacy. It went on to say that the entire Burton collection had been withdrawn, and I quote, for a period of critical analysis and self-reflection, as it includes material that is offensive and discriminatory and which reflects outdated ideas and practices. Well, I should hope that it does. It's 150 years later. Hasn't philosophy and science and society advanced since then? In 150 years from now, won't some of what we think and do today appear offensive and discriminatory with outdated ideas and practices? Of course it will. It's called progress. But how do you measure this progress? By comparing your moral certitude to what has gone before. But if that history has been hidden, well, then you have to rely on the gatekeepers, their interpretations, and what they allow access to. George Orwell warned us about this when he wrote 1984. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Do you know what struck me as odd? What is so ridiculous about this situation at Orleans House? It is that all of the withdrawn Burton items, the entire collection, are just personal possessions. Shoes, a hat, family photos, paintings and so on, all just benign objects. Yet what they have left on display, the only things you can see, are his books and biographies, which are the very items that actually contain the texts that they call offensive and outdated. What was going through their mind? Burton wrote some things we disagree with, so we're going to hide his slippers? Sadly, this Orwellian doublethink is not a unique situation in the arts and academia, of history being denied and recalibrated, with critical thought driven by dogma and devoid of sense, decisions made by feelings and not facts. Or perhaps I'm wrong, and we do need these institutions to manage history for us. After all, if they're run by people with pronouns and an employment CV of cultural and colonial self-flagellation, as in this case, then surely they are the best people to properly contextualise Burton for us. Orleans House held a show in 2021 called Brow of a God, Jaw of a Devil, Unsettling, the Source of the Nile, presenting an artist's collaboration and interpretation of their Burton collection, featuring a man playing a violin in a dress who performed a decolonial intervention to further interrogate the history of exploration. Their summary of the Nile search: it was all a story of bourgeois male rivalry. Those damn middle-class Victorian men, how dare they discover and achieve and do it all while wearing trousers. In her biography of Richard Burton, the author Fawn Brodie said that he was one of the 5 great British African explorers of the Victorian era, the others being John Speke, Samuel Baker, Henry Morton Stanley, and David Livingstone. And she's right. Speke, celebrated as the first European to discover the source of the Nile. Baker accompanied Speke to Lake Victoria and then later became the first European to discover Lake Albert. Stanley, the explorer and journalist who became famous after finding Livingstone, who was, of course, a courageous missionary. Great men, all rightly revered for their achievements. Statues have been erected in their honour. Livingstone himself is high up on the exterior of the Royal Geographical Society. The problem, though, is that once you are elevated, you stand out. You're exposed. There is always someone who wants to pull you down. Should the wrong person at the wrong time poke in the right place, then you could be knocked off your pedestal, just as some are trying to do to Burton. Let's have a go, shall we? Let us stand in moral judgment. We can topple and cancel all 4 of them. It's really not that difficult. Speke was a trophy hunter who enjoyed slaughtering even the most benign animals for fun. If he posted a picture like this of himself today, how long would his reputation last? Baker purchased a teenage girl in a Turkish slave market in Romania, taking her as his wife. Stanley became an agent in the Congo, working directly for King Leopold of Belgium, and we all know the horrors which emanated from that heart of darkness. And Livingstone, he spent years as a missionary in Africa, denouncing their jungle spirits, rituals and sacrifices, and instead insisted that Africans should worship an old white man who lives in the sky, and that they should become civilized by performing the Eucharist, a ritual that replicates eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ. In the end, he succeeded in converting just one man in the whole of Africa to Christianity, and he later lapsed. Oh, and after he sent his wife home to England, he regularly slept with the local women. There. How do you judge them now? By today's standards, those are all terrible things that would get them immediately cancelled. So how can they still be revered? It's because we understand that their flaws do not define who they were or what they achieved. Just as we can enjoy listening to Wagner despite knowing his anti-Semitic views. And we can read Hemingway without sharing his love of bullfighting. And we can admire a Picasso painting even though we know how abusive he was to the women in his life. Fawn Brodie was right. Burton was one of a handful of great African explorers, and I also concur with her opinion that as a scholar he towers over all of them. His output of travel writing, anthropology, linguistics, translation, history, exploration and geography was unmatched in his time and is still referenced today. Yes, you can dig and find a thought or opinion which progress has now left behind, but 150 years ago most of them were the consensus and broadly acceptable. Some of them weren't. We do not have to like or approve of everything he wrote. He had flaws, like all men. But if you do actually read his books, it is overwhelmingly apparent, in the words of one eminent scholar, that he was one of the few who championed religious tolerance and raised his voice against slavery, censorship and Little Englanders, and who tried to introduce foreign cultures to the British public. And this is why events like this are so important, to present, discuss, and promote Burton's history, to keep it authentic, to keep it alive. Earlier this year, I went to the Royal Geographical Society in London for an informal talk held in the library titled The Search for the Source of the Nile. Laid out on the tables were items from their collection, maps and possessions from, coincidentally, the same four great explorers Vaughan Brodie mentioned: Speke, Baker, Stanley and Livingstone. It was a fascinating evening, even though it lacked anything for Burton, as they have nothing in their collection. There was something about the atmosphere in that room. In front of me, there was the sextant that Speke actually used to find Lake Victoria, Baker's elephant gun that saved his life, the actual hats worn by Stanley and Livingstone when they famously met. What a privilege to have access, to see these historical pieces, to touch history, to be inspired. But there was also something else, something even more powerful than all of the artifacts on display, a brooding spirit that was unrepresented. I wandered around the library and came across the source of this discontent by the door, glowering over the evidence spread out below of the great prize that eluded him. His stature is still head and shoulders above any other African explorer. People will try to criticise, exclude and push him to the margins, to the edge of the room. But for as long as we can congregate and celebrate, Sir Richard Burton will remain on a pedestal.